I think it's kind of apt today that we should be here on the day of the Audit Commission when people are talking about, where we go now at the end of this 15-year, 20-year boom or whatever. You could, I'm sure a clever economist could calculate the net wealth of mankind 250 years ago and now, and of course we know it would be exponentially higher. And now we're at this wonderful point, I think, where it's taking off almost everywhere, isn't it, except probably your country and North Korea, but everywhere else things are going pretty well. But I thought maybe you might like to start by just filling us in on Professor O'Neill on the Enlightenment. What do we mean when we say the Enlightenment?
So the two most important things of the Enlightenment, which is firstly knowledge, knowing, and secondly risk-taking. Dare to know, the importance of daring, taking risks. And what I think the Enlightenment was fundamentally about was the idea that human beings don't need priests and experts and other people to tell us how to live or tell us what to do, but rather that we can do it for ourselves. And I think the Enlightenment challenged the idea of fate. It challenged the idea that we all have a fixed path in life that we can do nothing to control. It challenged ignorance and instead said that we should all find out stuff for ourselves. It elevated reason over prejudice. It said that we should judge things and measure things according to reason and progress rather than according to some kind of prejudged outlook. And it celebrated freedom. I think that is one of the key components of the Enlightenment. Every single Enlightenment thinker, from Locke to Kant to Mill and on, every one of them was absolutely committed to freedom and to the exercise of individual moral autonomy in working out what you think your life should look like and what you think your outlook should be like. So I think it's the moment in human history. It lasts for, say, 200 years or so, and then it kind of starts to go downhill.
Yes.
It's the moment in human history when we kind of break free of the straitjacket of tradition and religion and other problematic things, and instead kind of grow up and kind of take responsibility for our lives. I'm wondering, however, if that applies to Australia, Nick, and if whether those things that I always think about in relation to Europe, whether Australia has gone through a similar process in relation to Enlightenment.
Yeah, I always think Australia is a wonderful example. I call it the Enlightenment's greatest experiment. Because of the time when Australia was settled. And if you compare it to the United States, this is quite interesting. The United States is settled in 1620 when the Pilgrim Fathers go over. It was only 5 years earlier that Galileo had been hauled before the Roman Inquisition to be told that that the science was settled on the idea of whether the Earth revolved around the sun or the other way around. He got it wrong. They said he was... The proposition that the sun is at the centre of the world is absurd, philosophically false and formally heretical, because it expressly contrary to Holy Scriptures. And the Roman Inquisition, all that process is going on right the way up until about 1635, many years after the Pilgrim Fathers have settled. So they're settling in that pre-Enlightenment period, although it's just beginning to break, I think. And as a consequence, it's terribly hard for them. I mean, they have basically at that stage to get across the Atlantic. You had a compass, a magnetic compass, which had been around. I was quite surprised to learn since the Han Chinese in 200 BC. And the cross staff, which was a little device, just two sticks really, and it was invented in 400 BC. That's the extent of the technology. So you can imagine after a terrible journey that they really do think that God has delivered them. When they see the shore, they read Psalm 100 and they fall on their knees, and then they start trying to scratch a living out of the soil, but they've got no idea of the science of how to do it. And it takes an Indian called Squanto who shows them how to sprinkle fish meal, and they get a sort of bit of a crop. But still a third of them die in the first year, or in the first winter, I think. And then what do? They give thanks to God again. Goodness knows why. But contrast that to 1788, and Australia's settled. They have the technology on board that allows them to see longitude and latitude, so they can measure their journey. It's a relatively smooth journey. Only a handful of, I think 20 of the 900 odd convicts died and one Marine, which was remarkable, and part of that is because they're kind of starting to get scurvy, and they or understand scurvy, and they stop on the way to pick up fresh fruit and so forth. So already by the time they hit the shore, the Enlightenment's kicked in. It's a Saturday when they land, and they brought the chaplain with them. And the following day, on the Sunday, the chaplain says, "Shall we have a church service?" And they basically said, "We're too busy." So they just get on with it. And it's 8 days before they have their first religious service of any sort under a tree. And another 2 weeks after that before they have their first communion. So they're not, God's there, but he's in the background. It's man who's making his destiny here. And it's man who's discovering how to do it. And they've got the benefit of this agricultural science, which has been developing in Britain in the 17th century. So actually, there are some hard times, but then they just kick off quite well once they get the hang of how to cultivate the soil. So it's a story of the Enlightenment from the start, and an Enlightenment in social values too, of course, because, well, as is well known, the early governors were real anti-slavery people. There was no slavery. There was never going to be any slavery. And, contrary to much of the black armband history, the idea was that, they'd arrive here, they had a brilliant deal to offer the indigenous people all the benefits of the 17th century in return for, just allowing them to settle. So they thought they could come to a deal. That was the bit that didn't quite work out. But in every other respect, it was a scientific settlement, and it's remained so. There's never been a witch burnt in Australia.
Something to be very proud of. It's talking about the scientific aspect of the Enlightenment. I think that's one of the very important aspects of it. And a key idea of the Enlightenment, I think, in Europe and elsewhere, was the idea that man should set himself up against nature. We hear a lot these days about going back to nature and rediscovering nature and respecting that we're just part of nature. But it's important to remember, I think, that the Enlightenment grew out of an idea that nature, in the words of Francis Bacon, should be our slave. They were not very politically correct in them days in relation to the biosphere or anything else. And Francis Bacon, what he argued, the great kind of 16th century scientific thinker, he said nature should be our slave. He said it should be bound into service for humankind. It should be put in constraints. And then, in fact, in his most famous saying, he said it should be put on the rack and her secrets should be tortured from her. That's how early Enlightenment thinkers thought of nature. They knew in their heads that there were some secrets in nature that they couldn't get at. That there was something there that they needed to tease out and needed to understand better. And I always think one of Bacon's best quotes is this one, where he says, "As woman's womb had symbolically yielded to the forceps, so nature's womb harboured secrets that through technology could be wrested from her grasp for use in the improvement of the human condition." That's what he said. She's got these secrets, we've got to get them out of her. And of course, he's since been described as sexist for saying things like this. So typical. But I think what that shows is how important ideas are to progress. Because what comes from the Enlightenment, it's the engine of progress. It's the engine not just of intellectual progress, but of material progress. And it's only after Bacon and others kind of adopt this attitude of measuring nature, teasing out nature's secrets, using nature for the improvement of the human condition, that you see some great leaps forward in material wealth and economic progress. I always think of the example of coal. For thousands of years, people didn't do very much with coal. In the Roman era, women used to wear it because it kind of glinted in the sun. It was this strange black mineral. It looked quite nice around your neck. It's only really after the Enlightenment, after this daring to know the secrets, that people discover that actually inside coal there is trapped sunlight from 300 million years ago. And if you burn it, you can heat things, you can move machines, you can transport things eventually from one part of the world to another. So what you do is you tease out coal's secret and you use it to your advantage, and the whole world transforms as a consequence of that. The Industrial Revolution would have been impossible without the Enlightenment. And the Industrial Revolution, in my mind, is the thing that transforms the world forever. And I think another example I always think of is uranium. Uranium is a very good example of teasing out nature's secrets. For thousands of years, people just used uranium to make windows look more yellow. They used it to paint windows and to paint mirrors. What happens then in the 20th century is that you realize that somewhere in this thing is the ability to power entire cities, or in fact to destroy entire cities as well. So the Enlightenment's determination to get nature's secrets out is what transforms the material world around us. And I think that always reminds me of the importance of ideas. People always are a bit sniffy out about ideas. I think, it's just very aloof to talk about ideas and to sit in salons or to sit in places like this and talk about grand ideas and philosophies. But if people hadn't done that, then actual material, physical improvements in human life wouldn't have happened. If Galileo hadn't taken the risks and said what he believed, if Bacon hadn't been so sniffy about nature and been so determined to kind of put it on the rack, we wouldn't enjoy the material comforts that we enjoy today. So it's very interesting, I think, the kind of link between thought and progress, and I think the Enlightenment really shows that.
Yeah, there's a very interesting phrase, the spirit of progress, which sort of comes up time and time again if you look at Australian history in the 19th century. It was a sense that this was the driving force of the age, and it was built. Progress was a sort of multifaceted thing. It was scientific, then of course applied science, that flows through to industry, but also an idea that there's social progress as well, and all these four things go together. You can't really separate them. They're like this is the way mankind progresses. And you can see how this actually happened. Let's start with the coal. The coal transforms, the steam engine can produce a rotary force that you can then feed into a loom, so you can then start producing cotton in quite large, in large amounts, and then wool. And then they work out how to do this with wool. And the wool industry, the mechanisation of the wool industry is entirely aided and fed by Australia producing the sheep. There was a scrappy old thing before, but we actually invented the sheep. We took the merino, which came when it was produced 1 kilo of wool when it came in 1820, and a pretty rough wool that was really only suitable for army blankets. By the end of the century, the merino was producing 5 or 6 kilos of very, very fine wool that was sold, like a French Appellation wine, according to the name of the property stamped on it. So that's progress, and that was Australian progress. And along with that, what we did with wool, which we struggled to do with other things, we got a really good logistics chain going. We had the bullock carts that could pick the wool up from the farms quite efficiently and bring it down to the big wool houses in the various capital cities. We had this itinerant band of shearers. I mean, you'd die for labour conditions like that, wouldn't you? And you could just bring these people in when you need them and then get rid of them. There's no on-costs or anything. So we are, and the clippers are sending this stuff to Britain. So we thrive on wool because we're the most efficient. We feed the machines. And because of that, they're able then to put into place the child labour laws and get rid of the kids out of the factories. All goes together. Without one, there's not the other. And that's the idea that changes, which I think is what we're about to come on and talk about, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yes. So those are the good ideas, but then there is a kind of downward spiral, I think, in more recent years. I think in relation to the thing I was just talking about, which was the kind of use of reason and science, the kind of scientific method by Bacon and others to try and understand the world and to use nature to human advantage, you can see there's been a real shift in relation to that. There's now there's this contradictory thing where you either have a distrust in science today, no one trusts scientists, particularly on things like genetically modified foods, all the scientific evidence says they're safe and good, and everyone says, oh no, we're still scared of them. So you have a distrust of science, or you have the transformation of science into a new religion. And you can see that in the way in which people now talk about the science, the science on climate change. And if you criticize it or question it, you're a denier, you're a heretic, you're someone who needs to shut the hell up and stop speaking your mind. And I think it always, the one thing I find very interesting is the Royal Society's change of its motto. Because the Royal Society is founded at this moment of scientific experimentation, scientific progress in 1663. And its motto is on the authority of no one. It's actually in Latin, I'm not going to try and say it, but its motto is on the authority of no one. That's the motto of this new scientific institution that emerges in 1663. And then 7 years ago, in 2007 or 2008, it changed its slogan after all those years. It changed it to respect the facts. Mm-hmm. And I think what that really speaks to is a shift from a scientific method which was actually about challenging old forms of authority and relying on the authority only of empirical evidence, only of investigation, only of analysis, to a new slogan which is about bowing down before science and accepting its diktats and not questioning it. And that's a really important shift that takes place. The reason the Royal Society in 1663 had this slogan, on the authority of no one, it was a challenge to how the academy had been organised up until that point, which was very much on the personal authority of scholars, on the personal authority of priests. They were fairly dictatorial places where the authority of an individual, especially a priestly individual, mattered above everything else. Then the Royal Society comes along and says, no, we don't accept the authority of all these old fogies. We don't respect the authority of all these old traditionalists and religious people. We accept the authority of no one, just the evidence, just what we can discover ourselves through investigation and analysis. So the fact that we now have this shift to respect the facts, or the science, always said with a, the at the beginning, is very worrying, because it suggests that the scientific method has disappeared in a large part. The method of kind of being questioning and investigative and inquisitive and open-minded has shifted to a new era in which we're either scared of science and we think it's going too far, constant panic about technology and robots and so on, or even worse, we think the science contains the absolute truth about how you should live, how often you should recycle, how much progress there can be in the world, and we all bow down before it. So in terms of the kind of downward spiral, or the rise of Endarkenment, I think the scientific method, the disappearance of the scientific method, the disappearance of that willingness to challenge authority is one of the key problems there.
Yeah, and it happens quite suddenly. All around the world. It happens very suddenly. It's a shift in the attitude to science. Up until that point, we had an unconditional faith in science. Science was a neutral thing. It was what we did. It was knowledge. And then, what you did with that knowledge might be good or bad, but the knowledge itself was a good thing to chase. But then, very, very suddenly, in my view, around the late 60s, you get this point where suddenly a conditional view of science. So you think some science is good, some science is bad. Science isn't the way out of the problem. Science is getting us into the problem. And I trace it to the northern summer of 1969, when, first of all, man lands on the moon, and we remember those famous first words, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I mean, those are words straight out of the Enlightenment textbook. It's a small action for one person, and but this is going to benefit the entire species, everybody. We're all in our battle against nature. This is a step forward. 6 weeks later, what you get? Woodstock, and Woodstock is by and large university-educated people. These are the people that JFK wanted to go to university to turn them into rocket science. They had this big panic in the late 50s, as we did here for different reasons, that they weren't educating enough people. They were getting left behind. The Russians were winning the race for science. So massive increase in higher education. And they all come out and throw this festival. I remember in the movie there's a lovely bit where it's raining. If you remember, it tipped with rain, I think, for the first day. And this kid's interviewed, and he says, man, it's the CIA up there in the clouds. They're seeding the clouds, sending the rain down. This is a great moment of superstition, of unreason. And then people even start to get superstitious or unreasonable about the moon landing themselves, and you start to get the birth of these theories that didn't actually happen. And that's crucial. And it happens around the world for different reasons. And I guess the question is, do you identify that point in Britain as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there is a moment sometime in the 20th century. I think it builds up to the 60s, but the 60s is really when it explodes amongst the kind of the children of the bourgeoisie who suddenly turn their back on the Enlightenment and start embracing environmentalist ideas, neo-Malthusian ideas, anti-progress, or what Ayn Rand refers to as the anti-industrial revolution. That's the period in which it happens. And I think not only are we seeing the replacement of reason with unreason, but also another important thing that's happening is the replacement of freedom with unfreedom. Because one of the key aspects of the Enlightenment, one of the key ideas was about liberty. And if you read any of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, it's incredible. I mean, some of them write about science, some of them write about morality, some of them write about religion. But what they all have in common is a conviction that freedom is absolutely essential to the human condition and to the improvement of the human condition. I mean, all of them, going right back to John Locke in his letter concerning toleration in the 1680s, which is one of the early documents of the Enlightenment. It was supposed to be a private letter to a friend, but then his friend published it, and Locke kind of had to hide away from all these angry people. But what he argued in this letter, which caused such controversy, he just said we have to tolerate people who have different beliefs to us. We have to respect freedom of conscience and freedom of thought, except for Catholics. He was a bit funny about Catholics. But back then, in England, Catholics were like Islamists are today. They were a bit, loopy, so that's understandable. But he basically argued for freedom of conscience and freedom of thought. So in the start of the Enlightenment, it's all about the freedom in the mind. It's all about, you have to allow people to believe what they want to believe. And Locke said, you just can't force someone to stop believing something. It's not how it works. It's just that's tyranny. But then later in the Enlightenment, you get the argument that not only should you be able to think what you believe, but you should also be allowed to say it. So you get Spinoza. About 350 years ago, Spinoza wrote this sentence, which is extraordinary to think he wrote it at that time. He said, "Every man should think what he likes and say what he thinks." Now, I can't think of any politician who would stand up and say that these days without a million caveats about, but don't offend this group and don't risk national security and don't undermine public morality, blah, blah, blah. Every freedom is constantly checked with these kind of rights, responsibilities, balances, and so on. But Spinoza said every man should think what he likes and say what he thinks. His essay on freedom of speech, published 350 years ago, is still, to my mind, the best thing written about freedom of speech. And then you get to, you have people like Paine, Thomas Paine, who said that when opinion is free in both matters of religion and politics, the truth will prevail. He said, if we are free to speak what we think, everything will be fine. That's the kind of amount of trust they had in freedom. And then, of course, you get through to later enlightened thinkers like John Stuart Mill, who is all about freedom of speech. He's all about the freedom for people to think and say what they think. And now you have a real turning against that. You have an explicit turning against that over the past, 3 or 4 or 5 decades. This real shift away from the Enlightenment belief in freedom towards a new conviction that freedom is actually dangerous and a problem. And I think the two things that underpin the Enlightenment thinkers' devotion to freedom was firstly their belief that tradition shouldn't weigh heavily on mankind. We should be able to work out for ourselves through public debate and discussion what is true, what is right. You can't be told what is true and right by some expert. I mean, Mill makes that point explicitly, and so does Spinoza, actually. They both say the only way you can know if something is a good idea or a bad idea is if you subject it to public discussion, if you have a free discussion about it. And the second thing that drove them was a trust in the public. A trust in ordinary people's ability to hear ideas, to hear thoughts, and to work out for themselves independently whether they were interesting or rubbish. And those two things are missing now. The trust in the public has gone, and we now live under nanny states or nudging states that think we are all irrational and will turn into racists instantly if we get rid of Section 18C. They just think we're automatons who suck in ideas and act on them in a very irrational way. So they don't trust us. And also they think we do need tradition and authority, or new forms of authority, to guide us through life, to tell us what our consciences should be, and so on. So I think you're absolutely right. We're seeing a shift from reason to unreason. And just as scarily, we're seeing this shift from freedom, which was one of the central values of the Enlightenment, to a kind of public distrusting promotion of unfreedom, restrictions on free speech, free thought, and so on.
Yeah, I think the connection between freedom and progress is quite concrete. It's not an abstract thing. And Mill makes this point. He says if you shut down an idea, if you stop somebody talking, then he uses the phrase, you are robbing humanity. And because you just don't know whether that's going to blossom into a good idea or not, you've just got to let all ideas collide. And there's a great idea, which is a bit challenging actually, with the Scottish Enlightenment, where they used to talk about the equality of ideas, equality of men, equality of ideas. You were allowed to come out with whatever you wanted. But of course it will be tested, of course, in the marketplaces. The marketplace decides whether it's a useful idea or not, and then ideas build on one another. But unless the great thing about the Enlightenment and Australia, this is the democratic process. Everybody has a go. In fact, in Australia, we've got a rule you have to have a go, because we invented the word bludger. Did you know that? The word bludger, which is, a bludger comes from a word meaning somebody who lives off the immoral earnings of a prostitute. And it's a thoroughly disreputable thing. I can't think of a word in English that's quite as disreputable, but it implies the idea that we don't like people not pulling their weight. And the result of that, if everybody has a go, then your chances of success rise enormously. Similarly, if all ideas are put out there, or your chances of one of them coming to fruition or several of them mixing and coming to something sensible rise enormously. But as soon as you shut down debate, then you limit your chances of progress.
Absolutely. And I think, I think that's absolutely right. And the question of how progress happens is really important, and the question of what value is attached to progress, because I think what we're seeing in terms of the rise of the Endarkenment is a real diminishing of the values of the Enlightenment, the belief in reason, the belief in the scientific method, the openness of the scientific method, the belief in freedom. All those things are being wound back, and as a consequence of that, we're also seeing the downgrading of economic growth and economics, and of exploiting nature. You know, the kind of thing Bacon said now, if he said that now, he'd probably be arrested, or certainly branded a climate change denier and denied a platform in universities and newspapers and so on. Because we're also losing faith in economic progress and in big economics and in the idea that humankind should create a world of plenty. And that's one of the ideas that follows from the Enlightenment, but which is really being called into question today. And I think one interesting thing we're seeing is the return of the idea of scarcity, the idea that the resources on the earth are finite. And I really don't believe that. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, it sounds really mad to say that the resources on the earth are not finite, because obviously the earth is a certain size, it has a certain amount of stuff in it. But I think what the Enlightenment showed, and what Bacon and others showed, is that the usefulness of resources is determined by us, not by nature. You know, coal for centuries was just completely useless apart from as jewellery for rich Roman women. It's only our level of development that allowed us to realise its potential and to transform it into a useful resource. The same with uranium. Uranium was just nonsense for ages and ages. Then we discovered through technology and science that actually it could do wonderful things.
This is the key thing for me to understand what's gone astray, is this idea of going from the idea of progress, the spirit of progress, to what we're now in, which is the spirit of sustainability. You know, you're right. There was a conception that progress was infinite because resources were infinite, because, you know, the resource that mattered was actually the human mind, and you'll always find a new way of doing things better, or doing things more productively. And guess what? That's what's happened. I mean, there's been no point up to now where that's suddenly gone wrong, and yet, you know, we get the return to this new sort of Malthusian idea that you know, the planet can only support a certain number of people, that we can't actually exploit nature anymore. And in Australia, what you get, and in America too, but particularly in Australia, is this real onset of deep green environmentalism, and by that I mean this really strong dogma which says that, you know, actually we're just somewhere down in the pecking order. We're not at the top of nature's tree. You know, we've got no more rights, and we've got probably less rights than the tree frog. You know, that's the way people came to think about it, and are thinking quite strongly now of this idea of biosphere and diversity and all this. It's quite a foreign idea, and it only came in here in the 70s and took very strong hold here and in America, less so in Europe, where I think you get a more pragmatic green spirit developing.
Yeah, and I think it's really true to connect the idea of scarcity with the decline of Enlightenment thinking, because the most striking thing about Thomas Malthus, the original population scaremonger, I mean, not many people have read his thesis on population, which was published in 1798, but it's a direct response to the French Revolution. It's not a coincidence that it was published in that year. And he spends about 2/3 of it talking about the French Revolution, and only one section of it with all that kind of nonsense science that he made up about scarcity of resources and the number of people the planet could hold, etc. it was very much a reaction. I mean, I know you're more of a kind of Scottish Enlightenment person. I'm more of a kind of French Enlightenment person. I like
you like manning the barricades,
the guillotines and the barricades and all that. So he was reacting against it. He was saying, you know, oh God, progress is moving too far and too fast, and all those French people have gone mad. And therefore I have to come up with some new theory which will say stop, or otherwise everyone's going to starve to death. So it was explicitly a reaction against the Enlightenment. And then later in the 1840s, 1850s, there's this really interesting period when Karl Marx, another person you should all read, does a really good critique of Malthus. And he says Malthus's arguments were a libel against the human race. That's how he describes them. He says they naturalized poverty because they said that, you know, there are a certain number of resources, and if you use them all up, people will starve. So he said he accused them of naturalizing poverty, treating it as something that was part of the natural world. And he said, you know, and he also points out Malthus was wrong, because when Malthus was writing, there were about 980 million people on the planet Earth, and he said we couldn't feed them all. Well, now there are more people than that in China alone, and China has lifted 250 million people out of poverty over the past 20 years. No one in China starves to death anymore. So he was completely wrong. And what you can see in that Marx versus Malthus clash is a kind of early version of progressives taking on environmentalists. So the argument that I often have today, and I'm sure many of you do as well, against environmentalists who say there's only a certain number of resources and if we use them up we will all perish, those arguments have been had before. They've been had during the Enlightenment, towards the tail end of the Enlightenment, and I think it's important that we continue to have them and continue to remind people of the kind of ambition and hope and sense of progress and daring that informed the Enlightenment and which made man see nature as a tool for improving the human condition rather than as something we should be enslaved by.
Yeah, and one more point of difference between the spirit of progress and the spirit of sustainability is his attitude to social change. And I spoke earlier about how in the Enlightenment spirit all these things went together, scientific, technological, industrial and social progress all moved forward. You get to this point, and it really starts, I think, with the first progressive movement in America, at the start of the 20th century, but then really takes off towards the end, where the idea takes hold that actually no, the only progress that really matters is social progress. All the rest are incidental. In fact, you know, other forms of progress, economic progress, industrial, are actually militating against social progress. And that then becomes the chief public policy aim of the progressives. And you know, inevitably they tie themselves in knots because you get to the point where you can't actually do any of this stuff that you want to do because, you know, you've run out of money. And in any case, it's not handing out money or setting up schemes or government things that are going to make it work, but actually, you know, giving people the opportunity to earn a living and be part of the economy. This brings to another point, actually, the growth of the state. I mean, tell us about how you see the growth of the state fitting into this.
Well, I think that's something we've absolutely seen over the past few years, is the kind of unwieldy growth of the state and the spread of the state into more and more areas of life, and even into kind of the internal moral lives of citizens. And I think one of the key arguments of the Enlightenment, in fact, and it's right there in Locke very early on in his letter on toleration, is that there are some things the government should do and there are some things the government shouldn't do. And in fact, he says in his letter that the aim of his letter was to, as he says, settle the bounds between what government should do and what they shouldn't do. He says they should concern themselves with outward things, by which he meant infrastructure, protecting people from crime, protecting private property, those outward kind of useful things that government should do. But he said they should never concern themselves with what he called inward things, by which he meant our beliefs, our consciences, our thoughts, how we speak, how we interact with our fellow citizens, and so on. So right at the beginning of the Enlightenment, you have, you know, it's said in very religious terms. So Locke is a believer in God, and he talks about man's soul and the importance of protecting man's soul from interference by others. But it's basically an argument for liberty. It's basically an argument for, as he calls it, the magistrate, or as we would call it now, the state, to stay out of people's lives and to stay out of our moral lives. He even says, which is something that the nanny state should bear in mind, he even says people should be allowed to become ill. So he says in his letter, if a man is behaving in a way that's likely to make him sick, should the state step in and help him and stop him from becoming sick? And he says, no, it shouldn't. because people should be so free and so in control of their own lives that they should be allowed to let themselves fall into disrepair. So that's the kind of extent to which he said these are the bounds that need to be settled between individual liberty, or what he calls the care of the soul, and what the magistrate or the state can do. And that's been completely lost. And I think that's another winding back of the Enlightenment, because now what we have is the ever-increasing encroachment of the state onto every aspect of our lives, how well we are, what our physical bodies are like, what we eat, what we drink, whether we smoke, where we can smoke, and even what we think and what we can say. So all those, the Enlightenment was really, as Kant and others said, was about encouraging people to take responsibility for their lives and to grow up and to, Kant says, all these guardians have made it seem extremely dangerous to be mature and to be in control of your life. They've constantly told you, this is the term used, they've constantly told you that it's extremely dangerous to run your own life. And he says you've got to ignore them and you've got to dare to know, you've got to break free. That's exactly what I think we need to say now, because what we have is the return of these guardians, although they're no longer kind of religious, pointy-hatted people, but instead a kind of, chattering classes and greens and nanny staters. But they are the return of these guardians who are convincing us that it's extremely dangerous to live your life without expert guidance, without super nannies telling you how to raise your children, without food experts telling you what to eat, without anti-smoking campaigners telling you what's happening to your lungs. And I think we need to follow Kant's advice and tell these guardians to go away, and to break free of that kind of state interference.
Yeah, I think this is right. I think we've the great excitement there was with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the feeling that we'd won this argument. We won the argument that the state was worse at trying to organise the economy than the free market. We won that argument. We thought it was over, but we've yet to win the argument that actually individuals are better at organising their own lives for the most part than bureaucrats in Canberra. And we have now this huge and almost sort of unmovable blob of the state, which just sits over everything, and its role is to make rules and pass rules about what we should eat, what we shouldn't eat. And now even I was looking today at this great war on formula milk. There's almost a sort of prohibition movement stepping in that wants to ban formula milk altogether. And this is being aided and abetted, and in some cases driven by this massive state bureaucracy.
Yeah, and one very important point that Mill makes in relation to all this is that even if people are a bit stupid and make the wrong decisions when they're running their life, he said that is preferable to them being told what to do by the state or by experts. And the reason he says that's preferable is because through doing that, they use their moral muscles, as he calls it. They make a decision, they make a choice, they learn from it. And he says that, in fact, Mill says very explicitly, the only way you can become a properly responsible citizen, a morally responsible citizen, is by having freedom of choice. Because it's through the process of making a choice about your life, that you can take responsibility for your life. And he says, if someone else is telling you how to live and how to think and what to do, then you're no better than an ape who's following instructions. And Spinoza, much earlier, makes the same point. He says, you're no better than a beast if you're told what to think and told what to say. And the only way you can become a man, or a woman these days as well, have to be included, is if you are allowed for yourself to determine what your thought process should be, how you should live, and so on. So I think the irony of today, really, Nick, is that we have these states who think they are making us more responsible by telling us not to do this and not to do that. But in fact, they're robbing us of the ability to become responsible citizens. Because the only way you can become a responsible citizen is by being free and by making a choice and by using your moral muscles to decide what your life's path should be.
Yeah, and it's here, I think we start to see a ray of hope when we discussed this earlier. I remember, I think it was Rupert Murdoch pointed out that, there was no, the state, tyrant states could not survive the digital age. Information would flow. And sure enough, that's had tremendous influence. But I think I see the rays of sunshine in the internet and the way that this wonderful democratization of knowledge is really challenging the power of the expert class right across the board. I remember people said Wikipedia would never work. There's two kinds of encyclopedia. There's the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is written and published by experts, and then Wikipedia, which is just this crazy sort of thing where everybody chucks in their sixpenny worth. But guess what? I mean, Wikipedia is right more often than it's wrong. And now, with the system that's developed with footnotes and following sources, that if you start a Wikipedia, you can get to something pretty useful and meaty very quickly. And I think that the challenge to the dogma on climate change maybe would not have happened without the net, without the ability for people to get together in this sort of university of the people and look at the facts. Of course, the expert class would tell you that this is full of idiots, chucking rubbish about. Well, of course, there's a lot of people, idiots on the internet. There's a lot in real life, but it's a marketplace for ideas, and these get whittled, and the best ones survive. They get tweeted, like your articles. They get sent all over the place, and the worst ones never get looked at. So I see the ray of hope there. Do you?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's important to remember that one of the most terrifying things that happened to the old pre-Enlightenment elites was the invention of the printing press. I mean, nothing shook them like the invention of the printing press, because prior to that, they controlled ideas. They were the only people who published books by having these kind of crazy monks writing them out. Most people couldn't read, never saw a book. They were just told what was in them by some priest on a Sunday, often in a language they didn't understand. And then you have the invention of the printing press, which absolutely terrifies them, and they all respond by trying to clamp down on it and trying to crush it. In fact, if you read the arguments of the Levellers, who are the kind of most radical people in the English Civil War, one of their key arguments was we have to free the printing press. We have to have the right to print without the state's authority. John Milton makes the same argument in his great pamphlet saying we need freedom of the press. He says, the printing press is the greatest thing mankind has ever created, because for the first time ever, you don't need someone else's say-so to publish your ideas. I think the invention of the internet takes that a stage further, and that's why it's so terrifying, I think, to a lot of governments, and in fact, not just to governments, but also to, I don't know what we call them, the chattering classes, the liberal elite, certain sections of society who are a bit scared of the internet, because what you have here is the printing press gone crazy. People can now publish their ideas on their phone instantly. I could sit here and write something down, and it's published instantaneously. There are no more guards at all. You don't even need to have a kind of machine anymore. You can do it from the kind of palm of your hand. So I think there's real potential in the internet to rattle the world in a similar way to the printing press did, actually. My only concern would be that I think much of the internet is kind of shaping itself around the Endarkenment. I agree with you that it's a potentially useful tool for recovering the ideas of the Enlightenment, democratizing knowledge, spreading ideas and so on. But because the internet has emerged in an era in which progress is undervalued, we're seeing it kind of mold itself around that. I think Twitter is a good example of that. I think the reason Twitter was invented is because we live in a world in which there's no longer a barrier between public and private, and everyone likes to spout off what they think, even if it's just a prejudice and something stupid. So you can see the internet kind of shaping itself around some of the problems that exist in society. But having said that, the fact that you have this kind of extremely universal, extremely accessible device can only be a good thing. And we could potentially see, the American Revolution. One of the great things about that was the production of all these newspapers, which people just handed out on street corners, all containing more radical ideas than the last one, all stirring up the populace. Some of them even knowingly published lies in order to stir up the populace to kind of go and kill some Brits. So that kind of thing, where the sharing of information, the sharing of daring ideas, the internet absolutely has that potential.
It's the connection of minds too, isn't it, that does it? Because at every stage, of progress, there has to be a connection of minds. Thomas Edison had 20 people in his shed trying to work on the bulb and get it to work. And then, the Scottish Enlightenment, they just loved to sit around in the salons in Edinburgh and Glasgow, drinking red wine from Bordeaux. They had 1 bottle a day and 2 bottle a day and 3 bottle a day men. And the guys from Glasgow, it was about a day and a half, by coach to get to Edinburgh, but they do it just to exchange ideas. And now we can do this all the time, of course, with people around the world. Early days, but I see the signs that knowledge and ideas spreads across the globe very, very quickly, and everybody is enriched, and human intelligence generally moves on.
Yeah, I agree.
Are we being too optimistic?
No, I think that's fair. Yeah, I think
Because the Enlightenment's all about optimism.
I think we need more optimism.
Yeah.
We are surrounded by pessimism. We're surrounded by misanthropes. We're surrounded by people who think everything human beings do is destructive. We live in a world in which the creation of new cities is described as leaving an eco footprint on the planet. People always look on the downside. They will talk about the pollution in China and not talk about the fact that it has lifted so many people out of poverty, and the fact that more than half of mankind now lives in cities, which is just extraordinary. So I think, no, we need more optimism. We need to be more upbeat about the potential of humankind, about the great achievements we've made so far, and the potential of us to go even further. I always think to the fact that the space of time between the invention of flight and man walking on the moon is about 50 or 60 years. And if you think, that's just extraordinary that achievement was made in such a short period of time. You take off for the first time ever, and one of the Wright brothers describes it. He says, for generations, for thousands of years, mankind looked enviously upon the birds, thinking, if only we could do that, if only we could fly like those birds. And then what do? We just find a way to do it. We defy nature. Nature forgot to give us wings, and we say, screw you, nature, we're going to invent them anyway. And then 50 or 60 years later, we've got to the moon. And so when people say it's not possible to do this, you're too ambitious, you've gone too far, you have to slow progress down, I think it's worth reminding them of facts like that the leaps forward mankind has made in the past are just breathtaking.
Yeah.
And the potential to make more is really great.
So perhaps at this point we should throw the salon open. What do you think?
Yeah.
For the debate.